Joining me now is Jonathan Metzl, director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University and author of the fabulous book, Dying of Whiteness, and Congressman Richie Torres of New York. Thank you both very much for coming to the Sunday Show. Dr. Metzl, I'll start with you. You sent out a tweet after the Supreme Court decision where you tweeted out, the SCOTUS decision isn't fully about gun rights. Red states already have them. It's about overturning the will of blue state voters and destabilizing blue cities like New York. Explain that.
Well, I think there are two things that people really need to know about this horrible decision. The first is that cities like New York have had gun laws on the books for over 100 years, and this is not just New York, it's Los Angeles, Boston, Honolulu, other places, that basically say you can carry a concealed weapon in public, but you have to show a special need for it. Maybe you're a private investigator, or you've had a history of being abused by your spouse, etc. But you had to demonstrate that need, and what the ruling basically said is that the state of New York, the city of New York cannot do that, that basically anybody who wants to carry a gun in public should be allowed to do so. Now, I've written a book, Dying of Whiteness, as you just said, which shows the horrific effects of overturning permit laws. I looked at Kansas City and Missouri, and the minute they did away with just a seemingly arcane law in Missouri, guns flooded into the city and into the state, and officials really couldn't do anything about it. In fact, it got to the point where Sly James, the mayor of Kansas City, said, "Somebody please help us. We need gun laws." But because there was no way to do anything about it, it basically limited the ability to stop that. And cities like Atlanta, for example, they couldn't stop the flow of guns in, and wealthy people just created enclaves with their own private police. And so the evidence is very clear that if you overturn the private process, the permit process, it's horrible for cities with dense populations like New York. And so, again, it's so frustrating because we know what this is going to do, and yet the Supreme Court moved ahead anyway.
And Congressman Torres, I mean, you are a congressman from New York City, from the Bronx. How concerned are you about the implications of this Supreme Court decision?
I've never been more concerned. The Supreme Court's decision is going to deepen the epidemic of gun violence, which has become the leading cause of death of children and teenagers. For me, gun violence is not an abstraction. I live in the Bronx, which has seen a more than 200% rise in the number of shooting victims and shooting incidents. In my own backyard, I've seen 3 police officers shot, an 11-month-old child shot. And so the Supreme Court has made it so that masses of people can carry firearms in public in a city as densely populated as New York, which is a situation we've never seen before and could have untold implications for public safety. The Supreme Court has essentially held that cities like New York can no longer protect their residents from gun violence.
You know, there's a phrase in the Supreme Court decision that just made my blood run cold, and that was, you know, someone should be able to carry a concealed weapon for, quote, ordinary self-defense. How many times have we seen stories about someone feeling that they were threatened and they shot someone and that someone was black or brown?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research, including a lot that I cite in my book, that talks about how, you know, basically it ties into implicit bias, the idea of how you feel threatened, who do you feel threatened about. And they interviewed, there was a couple of studies that interviewed gun owners in Texas, and they said, "Why do you carry a gun?" And the gun owners would say, "Well, I could pull up to a bodega and a gangbanger could show up, or a carjacker or something like that." And then the follow-up question was, "Has that ever happened to you?" And they were like, "Well, no, but it could." So this idea of kind of imagining a racial other, which ties into histories of gun ownership and race in this country, really have horrific effects, not just about guns, but about race. And then there's a whole other part of this ruling which I think is equally, or in fact even worse, which is that Justice Thomas wrote that to meet the bar for new legislation, any kind of gun control legislation, you have to show that this gun law met the criteria from the late 1700s or the early 1800s. And so in a way, you know, New York had 30,000 people at that time. There were no AR-15s. And so in a way, what this is doing is overturning, I mean, I think the issue is going to be, it's overturning the modern gun control movement as we know it, because there were no red flag laws in the 1700s. There were no domestic violence statutes in the 1800s. And all of those, really, the entire gun control movement is thrown up for grabs.
And Congressman Torres, on the bright side, the president signed into law the first gun safety legislation in about 3 decades. Talk about the impact that will have on gun safety in general, or in your district in particular.
Yeah, and I want to quickly add
Sure.
to what Jonathan said. Justice Thomas developed a new test that prohibits judges, when deciding Second Amendment cases, from considering public safety. No judge in the future can give any consideration to public safety, can strike a balance between the individual right to bear arms and public safety. Look, the compromise stops short of the ideal. In a rational world, we would have universal background checks, bans on high-capacity magazines, bans on assault rifles, but it represents a genuine breakthrough that we have not seen in decades. And every mass shooting has a common fact pattern. The mass shooters tend to be under the age of 21, and at the heart of the compromise is enhanced background checks for those under the age of 21. And the compromise also partly closes the boyfriend loophole. So it expands the prohibition on firearms for domestic abusers to include intimate partners and dating partners, which I believe is a bona fide breakthrough.